Appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah. So hit me up, or more accurately, hit my audience up. Name, pronouns, and what the hell are you here for?
My name is Lonnie Ray Atkinson. Pronouns are he, him. And I reached out to Vaush because I wrote a book that I thought that he would be interested in the concept of. And the basic idea was to try to get progressive lefties to run uh, somebody in a Republican primary uh, as a lefty progressive. And I thought it would be uh, useful on a whole host of levels. And I guess that's some of the stuff we can talk about.
Yeah, the classic psyop approach. I was actually curious to talk to you about that because it's kind of like it's kind of like a wild card approach to politics that I think potentially could be really effective and potentially couldn't be. And I haven't ever had like a real conversation about it, so I kind of wanted to.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I talked to a bunch of people about this when I was coming up with the idea. The original idea was I was going to do a podcast about it, and I'd written out all these kind of sample speeches or like in campaign interviews and different stuff like that, and got to the end of it and realized that I didn't have the time nor the resources to pull it off properly, but I still had all this really good content. So I decided to go ahead and and put it into a book. But when I was doing in that process, I was talking to a whole lot of people and asking them what they thought. And the thing that I kept coming back to was that if you were going to do this seriously, I think you have to be earnest about it. I think that you have to be completely transparent about your beliefs. I think that you can be completely irreverent, and I think that that's a plus, but it can't be a prank and it can't be trolling. I think it's a matter of actually reaching out to folks and giving them, the level of respect that they would want out of any candidate.
No, so I completely agree with that because my main worry is always that, there is an innate level of duplicity behind running as a leftist Republican, But as I understand it, so like just to take it back so everyone's following, like in the audience, um
Mhm.
the idea is there are some districts where there's no point as running in a Democrat. Just flat out there ain't. The Democratic Party doesn't run any resources to some areas in this country, and by some I mean a lot. Um, Running as a Democrat basically just means that your run is a virtue signal. There's basically no shot of you winning there. I mean, there are Republican candidates that run uncontested in deep red rural areas. There are places where there's just no shot for any kind of representation outside of, well, Republicans. So the idea would be that given that there's not really any viability for a non-Republican candidate in some of these areas, you just run as a Republican, thereby gaining access to, the interest of the people, the ability to debate, in the primaries, the other candidates. But you get in the group, that actually does have political power there. And then you are just like an open, unashamed, you know, progressive or leftist,
Yep.
whatever it takes. And
Yep.
I think this is potentially very viable because you can be very disruptive when you do this. But I mean, you hit on the point right there, trolling isn't the right way to go about it. You need to be sincere because if you're not, I mean, I think the cohesion of the project kind of falls apart now.
Absolutely. The original idea was I was watching the 2020 primaries and I was thinking about how many people, how many lefty progressives there are that live in red districts. And when I say red district, I don't mean it just that it's gerrymandered into the ground, but that it may be legitimately Republican identifying. There's tons of districts like that. And I thought about how many lefty progressives live in those districts that feel like that they don't have a shot at ever having like any kind of electoral existence, right? And and when I came up with the idea, it was like, oh, well, that's a shame. And then I thought, well, if they could just run and win in the Republican primary, then the general election would be a breeze. And I started laughing about that. And I was thinking about, oh, that's an absurd idea. And then it hit me like what the absurdity was. The absurdity was that all of us, myself included, but all of us kind of assume that half of the voting population simply wouldn't vote for policies that would be in their own material best interests if their party bosses simply told them not to vote for those policies. And I thought, that seems crazy to me, because when I talk to Republicans and conservative folks, if you talk to them alone, they agree on all manner of progressive policy. Okay. And even the polling shows that. But when they go into the voting booth, they go into the voting booth as Republicans. And so the idea would be to kind of introduce the left to a lot of these folks, to demystify the left in a way, and to let them see that you're not the boogeyman that they've been hearing about from the leadership in the party and other media figures and whatnot. But in order to do that, you have to be able to show them that you will listen to them, right, and that you're willing to appeal to their intellect and sense of humanity. And I think that that's super important, because if you plan on running, I think you should run to win. It doesn't matter how big the odds are of winning. I think you should still run to win. But there's so many gains, I think, to be made even if you don't win. And part of that is demystifying the left to a huge part of the population that we should be organizing and have not been organizing for the past 30 to 40 years.
No, I fully agree, and sometimes all it takes is that little connection. They say, they say when fascism comes to America, it'll be brandishing a cross and wearing a flag, which is exactly what happened,
Mhm.
But, in a sense, like, leftism would work the exact same way. You always have to appeal to people using symbols, iconography, and cultural references they're most familiar with. And to a lot of, Republicans, the very image of a Democrat, and to a lesser extent an independent, is as
Mhm.
repellent an image as they can imagine, when it comes to who to take their opinions from. That in-group identity, even just running as a Republican, and others will call you a fake Republican, maybe,
Right.
whatever, sure. But it's an inroad, it's a foot in the door. And being a fake Republican puts you closer to them than being a Democrat, especially considering the level of division we're talking. Some of these people think Democrats are like baby-eating Satanist reptile people or whatever.
Right.
It reminds me, I talked with Charlie Kirk a year ago or something, and we were having a conversation about COVID, vaccines, pharma companies, and he was talking about, big pharma hoovering up profits from this whole thing, and they
Mhm.
do this a lot, these fake populist talking points. Republicans don't give a shit about reining in big business. They love big business, but they'll pretend,
Right.
yeah, they'll pretend like, oh, it's gone too far. We're so concerned with like the exploitation of the common man and so on. So I say, you can't talk to me about reining in big business. I want pharma nationalized. Like, you can't go
Right.
that far, Charlie. And he shut the fuck up after that. And what that
Right.
tells me is like this like fake populism they push only works unless there's a real populist in the room, at which point there's an easy shutdown to all their arguments. And you can only get that in these spaces if you have the right people there.
Yeah, and another thing too is that um, I think that we have to, when we're talking about seriously reaching out to people that see themselves as conservatives and may be far to the right. I think that the point is that you do have to meet them where they're at. All right. And part of that may be using the types of language and symbols that they relate to when it comes to their own religion. It doesn't mean you have to pander. I used to be, I grew up a fundamentalist evangelical. I'm a non believer now, but I understand both the mindset and the language. And I think that there's a lot to be utilized in using what I think uh, most of us would think are good examples that were left by the character of Jesus of Nazareth, right? So you can use those things and to appeal to them as long as it doesn't look like pandering. Now, what you were talking about with the healthcare, I think that it's important to meet them where they're at, because all of these people, all of them are underinsured and overcharged, right? And so when you talk to them about, let's say, single payer, right? The thing is that you can tell them, why does everybody ask these questions as if they don't know what a copay is, if they don't know what a premium is, what a a deductible is, what an out-of-pocket maximum is. These media figures and these politicians, they act like they don't know what those things are, like they don't know what you pay, and maybe they don't, but the people do, right? The people know how much they fucking pay for that stuff, and you want to reach out to them in a way that you are truly showing empathy for them having to navigate how fucked up the system is, right? Because they're having to deal with the same thing that Democrats are having to deal with when it comes to healthcare. They hate the system as much as Democrats do. It's just that their side is not offering anything for the better, and that's why, as a candidate like this, I think you want to ask a question over and over and over again when it comes to these issues. So if you're talking about healthcare and you're a lefty progressive running as a Republican, you say, why is it that this party has ceded better healthcare to the Democrats? That's crazy. Why is it that the only people that actually talk about really trying to improve the overall healthcare system is now, it doesn't mean the Democrats have a good solution, because I think the ACA was a total sellout, but the idea that the Republicans have been fighting against any improvements for the last 20, 30 years is unacceptable, right? And so you would think that would resonate with the Republican voting base, where they're asked questions like, why do Christian conservatives cede stewardship of the earth to the Democratic Party? That makes no sense, right? And so all these issues, one by one, that's the reason why they have to distract you with shit like CRT and trans athletes and Mr. Potato Head, because they won't do anything on these issues.
Well, yeah, I fully agree. I mean, it's been the strategy of the Republican Party for, certainly over the past decade. I mean, it's been the case broadly for a while, but I think it's really been ramped up. They never talk about their own policies, like, ever.
Right.
They don't talk.
Right.
Democrats talk about Democrats, and Republicans talk about Democrats. It's
right.
always, it's framed as an oppositional thing. Maybe the Republican voter is taught government can't do anything good for you. So what are you going to get from Republican legislators? Well, the main thing you're going to get is not having those crazy Satanist, tax and spend Democrats in charge. Their primary, there are wedge issues like gun rights and abortion issues, but I think for the most part, it's just about opposition, which means that approaching them as a Democrat in a lot of these places is just a non-starter from the get-go. But they don't even have these internal conversations, like there isn't a culture of accountability for issues in the Republican Party that actually affect people's lives. As bad as the Democratic Party is, there is a bit of a culture on that. There are, it is expected in liberal, even moderate liberal circles, it is expected to believe that the politicians they advocate and vote for will attempt to address problems that actually affect people's lives. That's a real thing, not to the extent that I want them to, but it's a thing that exists. But in a lot of Republican circles, these people are not holding their breath on any Republican candidate successfully improving any part of their lives. It's not there's not what do you call it? A civil culture surrounding that. They don't ask those questions. They don't get asked at town halls or debates or whatever, why don't you want to do something about our healthcare costs? Or, why aren't you fixing the, car dependency issue? Or why public transport's so bad? Or why, prices are going up or whatever. They're not held to account for anything outside a collection of culture issues that right-wing media talks up nonstop. So, I mean, it's about disruptiveness, right? You can introduce those questions.
Yeah, and there's a scene in the book where he's the character's talking about how he runs into a woman that's working at a truck stop, and she says, I can't vote for you because I don't agree with you on all these different policies, right? And then he asks her, okay, well, but what matters to your life? And so she kind of goes down this list. He said, that's why you should vote for me. And goes all the way down the list. And by the end, they're kind of laughing. He says, look, whoever you've been voting for the last 20 years, you've agreed with them on all these things, right? And she says, yes. And he says, how many of those people actually did something and tried to do something when they were in office for you? on all these different issues? And she says, none of them. And he says, that's the reason why you should vote for me. Because even if you disagree with me on some of the policies, at least you'll know you have somebody in there fighting for you. I mean, I think that it matters to people if somebody is actually fighting for them. I had a really interesting, and not just fighting for them. This is important too. This is super important. It's not just the fight, but the fight is huge. But that also that they see you as an honest person. I used to work for a guy when I worked a retail job one time, and I had a boss who told me, and he was a good dude, but it was funny because he told me that he would have voted for George W. Bush 18 times because he liked his fiscal policies. And so that's basically the conservative Republican that he was at the moment. And one day we got to talking about Ralph Nader, and he out of the blue kind of told me if Ralph Nader would have ran in the Democratic primary instead of running third party and would have won the nomination, that he would have voted for Nader. And I said, why? That's crazy. You said you'd vote for Bush, a zillion times. And he told me, he said, because I know who Ralph Nader is, and I know he's an honest man. And he was like, and I've never had a chance to vote for an honest man in my life. And it kind of blew me away, but I think it makes a lot of sense the more and more I talk to people about politics, is that they're so cynical that they're almost not paying. It's like I say that you don't, like a lot of times in politics, you don't have to know shit except for who's full of shit, because most people are voting against a party rather than for a party a lot of the time,
And I've talked about this with my audience, and it's really difficult for people who follow politics as like a passion to understand. But a lot of people, when it comes to who they vote for, what they care about, we are talking about a completely incoherent, vibes-based approach to politics. Like, that's all across the board, not just a Republican thing. You talk to an average person about politics, like, well, why do you support this thing, and why do you support that thing, and so on and so on. And if you're lucky, you'll get bumper sticker answers. And if you're unlucky, you're going to get the most convoluted, incoherent, rage-inducingly meaningless diatribe on like this hyper-specific, completely like obscure, non-consistent ethical system that only this person has that leads them to this like voting pattern. But trustworthiness is big up there on that, I mean, when you're talking about stuff like tax policy or healthcare, a lot of people do not know what would make the country or their lives better. They can't. I mean, the level of education required to understand even a fraction of this country's political system and all of its economic, like, subsidiary issues, it's obviously, like, the average person is not going to be fully on board with that. I don't know everything going on in this country. Nobody does. So, the math arguments aren't the kicker for a lot of folks. It's just,
right.
You talk about, I mean, you say approachability, right? You don't want it to feel like you're running a con. And I resonate with that because I don't think there has to be anything like dishonest about it. You run as a Republican in some of these areas, well, yeah, I'm a leftist, I just wanted to add my voice to all this, but you treat it seriously, you don't talk down to people. Yeah, I have these ideas. I'm not ashamed of it. I just want to talk with you about them. I think that's a fine thing. Political parties they're not prescriptively supposed to contain only a given set of political ideas. A political party is just a political party. And in the same way that it's good when communists run in Democrat primaries to try to fuss people up, about pushing everyone left, there's no reason why that process can't work to the Republicans either. Certainly in areas where the Democrats, like, running as one is just a non-starter.
Yeah, I think you kind of raise a good point about, so I kind of always want to ask why people are where they're at. So I think that you're right. I think most people that are not political junkies, right? It is difficult to figure out what's really going on, to figure out who to trust. But the problem is that that a lot of the times that folks are at that point by design, because we've our educational system and all the other spheres of influence, all our other institutions, they don't nurture critical thinking skills. They don't nurture media literacy, social and historical reference. So they nurture these things. So and on the opposite side of that, there's a mountain of conditioning that goes along with why people think the way they are. So I know that a lot of folks like to, make fun of QAnon believers or people who are worried about CRT. But I think about the conditioning that has gone on in social media and kind of the media echo chamber. And then I think to myself, yeah, but is that any crazier than believing in the invisible hand of the market? Right? And is that any crazier than believing in complete American exceptionalism? You know? And as lefties who may have gotten to the point where they've seen past, capitalism being the end all be all, or seeing past imperialism, being this good thing, right? Well, I think that we have to ask, well, how did we get there? And for me personally, I got there because I was finally willing to ask and ready to ask certain questions that had been super uncomfortable for me to ask before. And I think that if you're going to run a campaign like this, the primary goal of what you're trying to do is to get folks to ask those questions, to ask questions they haven't been either willing to or felt comfortable asking before.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's, the QAnon stuff might be more destructive, but yeah, you're right. In terms of the echo chambers that these people are put in, if anything, there's a kind of sentimental faux populism in the QAnon bullshit that wasn't present before. Funnily enough, that free hand in the market stuff is really unpopular now in right-wing circles,
Mhm.
The government deregulation, like the, big swamp DC people are ruining our country with regulations, that's still present. But the idea of like trust the corpos are going to do us all good, that is not like a mainstream Republican talking point anymore. It was 10 years ago, it isn't now. Because nowadays the word of the land, whether it's being appealed to genuinely or not, is populist fervor. But it's fake when they do it, when their candidates appeal to it. But the fact that that's popular does indicate, even if it's popping up in shit like QAnon, it does indicate that people are kind of dissatisfied with the answers that they're getting through traditional electoral means. Populations
And
are not pushed into populism because they're fully satisfied with the way the elections are going. That just tends not to be how things go.
yeah,
Yeah, and
that's right. And I think that
gotta heal on that.
just real quick, I think that you make a really good point. So Donald Trump's main rallying cry during his campaign was "drain the swamp." Now, it doesn't matter whether he delivered on it; it matters that it was effective. And so, I think that the in the book, I put that the main policy plank that this character is running on is to get money out of politics, because it doesn't matter what other policy that you're talking about. You can bring it back to money in politics. And if there's one thing that all conservatives agree on, is that they fucking hate corruption. All right. And if you can capitalize on that and then show them why your policies are better on every one of these issues that affects their life, and show them that you have an answer, some type of solution, right? And the reason why the other side, all your opponents, ain't got shit to offer is because of that corruption and because the donors won't allow them to offer them a solution. And if you can make that clear and concise, then I think it would resonate with a lot of folks, because they're already on board with that everything is corrupt right now.
No, yeah, and I mean the difficulty is that so much of the political instincts of this like voter base have been kind of corrupted with the imagery and the associations that Republicans have worked so hard to associate. I think this is one of the reasons why they're so intent on calling Biden and the Democrats socialist or communist or whatever, it's not just to make them sound scary. It's not just Red Scare stuff. It's also that actual real life socialists and communists in America are some of the most aggressively anti-corruption, anti-establishment groups there are. And that would be really, really, really appealing to a lot of these cynical Republican voters if they thought of them as detached groups. That's why Republicans are so intent on directly attaching Antifa to Biden. Because in reality, Antifa, whatever you may think of it, how politically effective they are, corpo associates they are not. And the imagery that they represent is almost like cowboy-esque in its rugged individualism. You know, you've got like these random Americans with no broader corporate or political ties just dressing up to go fight people downtown. I mean, there's something almost quintessentially attractive about that in concept, you know, like as an aesthetic. But it all gets ruined if you think of them as like soy cuck teens working on behalf of local Democratic operatives. And I think that's part of it. You know, Republicans are terrified of their voters seeing what actual populists look like. They're very scared of that echo chamber breaking. That's why they don't bring on opposing like guests anymore. They used to on Fox News and on Tucker Carlson. They used to bring on opposing guests. They used to have arguments. Now they don't. For the most part, it's very echo chambery. They're very, very intent on not allowing like the real enemy or like the real opposition be visible to their voter base. And I think, you know, I mean, if anything, that's a demonstration of the fragility of their position, I think.
Yeah, it's funny because so the character in the book's name's H.F. Valentine, and
Tell me about the book format, by the way, because you haven't. Like, are we fiction, nonfiction? Tell me the premise.
Okay, I just didn't want to try to fluff it too much. You know what I'm saying?
Fluff it whatever you consider to be an appropriate amount.
Okay, yeah. All right. So the book title is "Don't Think of a Republican: How I Won a Republican Primary as a Lefty Progressive, and You Can Too," by H.F. Valentine. And so H.F. Valentine is this satirical candidate that basically has run this year and won. And he won the primary and then won the general. And then next year, he decides to put together a book that that puts together all his campaign speeches, interviews, and campaign ads, or at least a good curation of them. He puts those out for people to follow in his footsteps. And the book's out right now, but it's a satirical thing that you would read the book and see a kind of not a blueprint, but to read it as an active read where you start to think, well, how would I sell these kind of progressive policies to a conservative voting base? And then you have an example there of how H.F. Valentine did it and was successful in it. And it's supposed to inspire people to actually think about how they would do it and then to actually give it a shot. I had originally wanted to pitch the DSA this idea because at least they're semi-organized and you could actually get together actual campaign staffs to run these. But anyway, so the idea is that H.F. Valentine is kind of recalling all these speeches and stuff. And one of the talks he gives about is the danger of labels and how basically if a label is thrown at you, it's going to be defined by whoever threw the label. And so a lot of the times these labels don't have to mean anything because they can mean anything. Right. And you look at words from treason to terrorism to conservative to Republican to Democrat to liberal. It doesn't even really matter what the actual definition is. You just have to basically call somebody that, and it becomes derogatory. And that's a huge problem for a candidate like this. So he basically addresses that not only against his opponents, but against the media who will also use this to shit on him. And he basically tries to turn it around and say, look, every time that they bring up that I'm this label or that label, you think to yourself, what are they avoiding talking about? Why is it that I continue to talk about this issue that affects your life and they continue to call me a name, right? And it goes back to a story, if you don't mind. I'm just going to tell you this funny story, and it's in the book as well.
Yeah.
This actually happened to me. A very close person to me called me up years back and was like, "Hey, Lonnie, Barack Obama's a socialist." And I said, "No, he's not a socialist." And he said, "Yeah, he is." And we went back and forth. And I said, "Look, you're not going to take my word for it. So what I want you to do is when we get off the phone over the next week, I want you to go find a bunch of socialist publications, all right? And I want you to just go find them and read them, and see what they say about Obama, right?" So he calls me about 2 weeks later, and he's like, "Hey, Lonnie, I did what you said, and guess what?" I said, "What?" He said, "They hate Obama." And so Part of that is to say that that's how easy it is to defame somebody, is to call them a label that most people may not even know what the actual definition of the label is. As long as they think it's a bad thing, that's all they need to hear. The second part is that when you try to convince convince someone of something that they really do believe, you can't just do it as I have the authority, I have the information, and you're wrong. What I did was I put a situation together where he was allowed to find it out on his own authority. And when he did that, he was done with it. He didn't ever call Obama a socialist again. And so I think that that's again, it's a matter of how you approach people and appealing to their intellect and their sense of humanity. It goes a long way. It may not get you across the finish line in a political race, but if you come back to those people after that race organizing around an issue, they may be willing to listen to you in a way that they would have never listened to you before that.
No, I fully agree, and you're right about labels. They're basically the death of any like actual attempt at understanding one another. You load them with so much meaning, and especially nowadays, right? I mean, we know words don't really mean anything. Certainly not in common political discourse. Obviously, like nothing means anything. If anything, the very humanistic appeal to values like trustworthiness, it almost feels like a more effective metric for convincing people of given political positions, because only the most like policy wonk type nerds are out here caring about the specific political causes of stuff like inflation, you know.
Mhm.
The issue is even the politics of trustworthiness have kind of fallen to the wayside. I mean, Donald Trump, for example, being like the cartoon character stereotype of a untrustworthy, grubbing miser character,
Right.
being seen as like a, an envoy of honest American Christian values by Republicans. It's really difficult to hit on that. But a lot of that, I think, is it's very targeted, it's not ubiquitous. I think you can still get people on an individual level, I think everyone can be gotten on an individual level. Whatever your bias is towards any set of ideas, everyone is susceptible to like a calm evening of like talking to someone and like a cup of coffee, like everyone is. There's no matter what biases you have against a given political group, like everyone can be sat down. That's why you have it's like a whole phenomena of like one of the good ones, right? Where like you
Right.
can have people who are like politically incredibly racist, but they'll know and be friends with like a black guy, and it's like, oh well, he's one of the good ones. And in reality, the only thing it is that he has this made up idea of what black people are in his head that he cultivates his political opinions around. But once, like in meeting one in real life, rather than realizing that his beliefs were a misconception, he instead thinks of it as like an exception. Or sorry, we're not an exception. His beliefs were wrong. He thinks the like one cool guy he's seen is an exception, But you can get people on that. It's just a testament to how susceptible any group of people are, no matter their biases, to counterfactuals delivered the right way. You know what
Well,
I
and
mean, right?
I think that you make a good point uh, about being around people. The idea that we on the left have basically kind of written off so many people when it comes to organizing, and much less sometimes even talking to. So if we never reach out to these people, if we never spend serious quality time with them, then they're going to believe about us whatever they're told by the people that they do hang around with and that they look up to, right? And whereas if you can start building community in the area that you're at, then and again they know who you are, then they're not going to believe something that they're told by somebody else about you. I think that's it's a serious thing about meeting people where they're at. It's just showing up sometimes. Another thing that you kind of mentioned made me think about the second slogan that I use beyond just the first slogan I use is "Let's get money out of politics and see what happens." All right. The second slogan is he says over and over, I'm not telling you something that you don't already know. And that idea comes out of something that Norman Finkelstein was writing about a few years ago, where he talked about how Gandhi's approach was that you're not going to get people to act on something that they see no truth in, but your job is to get them to acknowledge what they do know to be true in their hearts and then to act on that. And I think that on a ton of issues, you can actually get people to do that. You can get, even if they're reluctant to acknowledge it, you can get them to admit what they do know in their hearts to be true, right? But they're not going to do it if they don't see you as somebody who is worthy of even listening to. And again, that goes back to what you're saying, is being there and giving them an example that is markedly different than what they've heard about you before that.
Well, that's the reason why, I mean, that's the exact same reason why, like, cities tend to be more left-leaning, right? Tolerance towards people of different opinions goes up when you are in proximity of those people with different opinions. Likewise, people of different races, religions, ethnicities, languages, etc., etc. The closer you are to a given group of people, the more time you spend around them, the less likely you are to be politically biased against them. There's usually an initial uptick of dislike. Like, for example, if a neighborhood which is mainly redlined suddenly has an influx of like Black or Latin or whatever neighbors, there will be a spike in distrust and ethnic bias to begin with, but over time it'll level out, and like, people will be on average more progressive than before as people get used to each other's differences and become tolerant of them. And that's just, I mean, that's just basic. Like, if you're around, if you're exposed to anything, you're more amenable to it. And I mean, this is just an extension of that. You know, it's an attempt to break down echo chambers, and you can see the effects of this too in some of these red districts, right? Because a lot of these red districts, like the parts of the country where Democrats don't even run, are so red. Like, it worked like 90-10, like 95-5, like insanely red, some of these areas, you know? Because there's not even like another choice, basically. Most of the big, like, Democrat strongholds, the high population cities or whatever, you know, you get like 80-20, 70-30 splits or whatever, you know, there are conservatives everywhere. But there are areas, mostly the very rural ones in America, where it's just like totally, like, completely across the board. And that's not a natural phenomena, you know. That's a product of having no exposure to other ideas. It's a real issue, and it causes a generational, like, knowledge gap that it can't really be addressed without people being willing to, you know, get their hands dirty a little bit and talk with people they disagree with.
Yeah, it's difficult. I remember, I was growing up with a buddy of mine who I'm still really, really close with, and we talked about this, not too long ago, about how when we were younger in high school, that I would say that, let me put it this way, he was more racist than I was. Okay, and
I'm sorry.
I remember having a conversation with him and saying, "How come you think that you know all this stuff about Black people and you've never even had an actual conversation with one?" And he told me, "Well, I don't need to have a conversation with him." And I remember thinking, like, that's crazy to me. And at the same time, I didn't get that he was, at the same time, that he was less homophobic than I was. And it's because somebody in his family was gay. All right. And that he had spent all this time around them. And so he didn't have the same hangups that I did, right, around that issue. Right. And so, we've talked about that recently, about, what the changes were after we had those conversations. And it was really just going out into the world and meeting people, having conversations, and seeing that there's not this big difference between you, that we're all humans, and being able to be vulnerable around people and have a little bit of trust. But it takes being in people's presence and being willing to have those conversations. The big thing is, one of the reasons why I think that we have such a hard time with this is because we have so few community spaces left that are outside of maybe religion. It used to be that labor was a big part of building community. There's the whole bowling alone, about bowling leagues, and There used to be more, organizations that people were a part of where it might be a lot of folks with completely different political viewpoints all hanging out together in this one group all the time. And that community building goes a long way to, again, demystifying some of these labels and some of these political stances as well.
Yeah, the thing that's really frustrating too when it comes to trying to bring people over is that Republicans have been putting a ton of effort, energy, and money into trying to find ways to get at left-leaning circles, or at least more moderate independent circles, without having to do like direct engagement. So a good example of this would be like Gamergate or any of the online like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro-esque stuff, with this very highly funded effort at bringing over a bunch of like white libertarian teens via, whatever, smug debate bro, anti-SJW, anti-feminist, whatever aesthetic they appeal to, gamer crowd, pull them over to the right, there's that effort. They're willing to get their hands dirty. Right now, conservatives are trying to weaponize the language of feminism by pairing with TERFs in their attack on trans people. Like all these conservatives are screaming about the sanctity of women's sports and the need to protect women's spaces, like they've ever given a shit about any of this.
Right. Of course.
In an attack on trans people. But Democrats will not get their hands dirty with any messaging that touches on rural issues. They won't do it. Anything that has to do with like, and if you're out of a city, if you're talking about people who, hunt, or people who work on a farm, or people who have more than 1/8 of 1 acre of land to house, like Democrats do nothing for these people. Nothing. It's not just they do nothing, they're contemptuous of these people. Like they'll openly mock, like, oh yeah, these country bumpkins or whatever, and they'll act shocked that a huge portion of the country seems to be like permanently, unalterably red no matter what. Like they'll do nothing to reach out to these groups. They'll mock these groups, and then they'll be like, why do all these rural people keep voting against their material interests? Like, well, what the fuck do you think is going to happen? Like all you've done is indicate to them that you don't care about their material interests.
In the United States, a lot of people that live in the city really have no idea how many small towns there are and how much rural area and rural population there is. It's massive. And those people are people just like you, the same way that we want, that we would hope that the Republican voting base would listen to issues that we think that they should be, quote unquote, maybe more tolerant on, right? Or more open-minded on. I think that you're right. I think that a lot of the times we're not open-minded to a lot of the issues that are concerning rural voters as well. And I actually think it's more than just the politicians, though. And this is a problem not just with politics, but just the left in general, that when you find a group of people that you vehemently disagree with, you can do two things, right? You can mock them and ridicule them, or again, you can ask how they got there and then try to figure out how to get them, to come home, and I think that, yes, it might feel good, in the moment, to mock somebody who might have a fucked up view or be at a very low moment, right? It may feel good to ridicule that person, and it may end up making you look really good in front of the fans that you already have, or the people that look up to you already. But when we're talking about movement building, that's only going to entrench those people and make them hate us even more. And the way that I look at it is, if we believe in a better world, if we believe that better world is actually possible, it's going to take a fuckload more than just the left. It's going to take more than the entirety of the Democratic Party. It's going to take a whole lot of those people that sometimes we say that we can't even talk to, right? And so if that world that we say that we believe in is real, then we have to start actually figuring out how to become brothers and sisters with those folks and making them see us as their brothers and sisters as well.
No, I
And that's
fully.
and that's hard. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, right? But that's the fucking work. That's the work that has to be done, or we've lost.
Well, that's
You know?
politics. I mean, and rural America was the center of populist movements through the 19th century. You know, back
Uh-huh.
when populism was a big like farmers thing.
Yeah, that's right. The farmers. That's right. They organized across the whole damn country by just going on and literally knocking on each other's doors, and was able to amass a massive amount of power that way.
And it worked back that. I mean, a rural area door knocking is way more powerful. And there are a lot of people in rural areas. I think something like a fifth of the country is in what's technically defined as a rural area. But I'm looking right now, and apparently an area is considered part of an urban cluster if it has at least 2,500 people, which means I think a county area that has only like that has 3,000 people in it cannot be defined as rural, depending on right. So like it. So if we're talking about a fifth of the population, if we're only talking areas with 2,500 people per territory or less, but there are
All
going to
right.
be a lot of areas that are functionally rural with like 10 times that many people.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
yeah,
easy,
so
easy.
we're probably talking like around 40 to 50% of the population
Yeah,
lives in areas that like most liberal Democrats would snort at, like turn their nose up at. This is one of the reasons why I'm so against gun laws. Not just because I don't think they're an effective way of dealing with like a lot of the issues we see. Yeah, I think that a lot of the problems we see associated with gun, there are some gun laws I'm in favor of, but a lot of them, like especially this Beto O'Rourke tier, like reflexive hatred of guns, like the why, like you hear stupid shit like Democrats say, like why would anyone need a gun like this? And they're talking about some gun that like effectively was invented 150 years ago when it's some hunting rifle or something, like
right.
they say dumb ignorant shit about guns all the time, but like it's kind of like a cultural marker, right? Like if you're like a rural person, it doesn't take like the tremendous cluster of brain cells to recognize that a lot of Democrats think of you kind of as like a contemptuous weight on the country, like an anchor dragging along the ground. Um,
Yeah,
and
I think when you're talking about guns, that if if the Democrats really did want to make huge gains on this, then one thing that they should be doing is trying their best to include gun owners in on the conversation and take them seriously and separate the issue from the NRA, to demonize the corrupt actors, but then to take seriously the average gun owner that believes in gun safety as well. I think the other thing is that they do need to get hunters on their side, because hunters traditionally um, have seen the gun differently than folks that who are just excited about handguns and whatnot. I remember I was in Iceland a few years back, and I was at an Airbnb and I was staying with this couple, and the guy that was there, he was a big hunter, and when I say like he loved his gun, like his survival depended on his gun, right? But he couldn't believe the way that guns were looked at in the United States, and it's because he took hunting so seriously. I think another thing is that you have to change the terminology that we use on a whole number of things. I can't remember. I just read this recently, and you might know what this is, but there was some place that was actually having an issue with, I don't know if it was mass shootings or it was just multiple shootings, and they changed the name that they used to describe it. And I think they started calling it like coward shootings or something like that.
no,
And
I haven't
they
heard of this.
Yeah, and then they actually went down. And I think that I know that we don't want to entertain the concept of like toxic masculinity, but I mean I'm in my mid 40s, and I remember when I was a kid, if you got into a fight with somebody and they pulled a gun or a knife, they weren't shit. They were seen as a coward, right? And today, I think a lot of folks do feel like that their gun is what makes them a badass. And I
No,
think that you have
so
to start changing the narrative
100.
about what it means.
This is what you mean about the NRA. And I talk about this gun culture in the US. Yeah. Where like you have like the trifecta of like fake wannabe like military guys who are too cowardly to like actually enlist, or too old, or disabled or whatever, but they'll all like LARP like some kind of like junior militiaman of the US. You have like cop and cop wannabes and all their hanger-ons, and then you'll have like all the NRA civilian gun armory building types, and all three of these groups are like the fixtures of having a gun equals masculinity bullshit, like.
And I was just going to say,
And the
I
NRA
remember,
is like a fixture of that.
right, exactly. And I remember when it used to be the police that were a voice for what we called gun control at the time, right? Because they were afraid of getting shot. And you fast forward 20 years, and they had become one of the the rank and file police guys. A lot of them had become the biggest supporters of the NRA, as the NRA would lobby for bullets that would pierce their vests.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a cultural marker, right? I honestly think a huge part of the gun like debate in this country is arbitrary, in the sense that like you could flip the teams, make it so Democrats are the big pro-gun ones and Republicans are the anti-gun ones, and nothing would fundamentally change outside of like the group associations, So all the arguments would just switch sides, and both sides would start fundraising on the opposite arguments. But aside from that, it wouldn't be politically incoherent. It would be the same level of like, Republicans would push for gun restrictions in mostly like a racist way, like targeting POC communities or whatever, and Democrats would be advocating for broad gun use in some kind of like, rote, apolitical, seeming neutral constitutionalist way, and it wouldn't, like, nothing would fundamentally change. It's about why you employ those arguments and the effects you think they're going to have more than anything. And there's only one way to be pro-gun in this country, right? Like, that's what you mean. That's the whole NRA thing. Like, you can't. The only other organizations like the SRA, and nobody cares about the SRA outside of like primo lefties online,
And the sad thing is that you don't have enough time in a in a campaign to do lectures, and nobody wants to listen to lectures, right? But the sad thing is it would be nice to give a history lesson that showed people that the NRA didn't used to be this way, that they actually used to be for a lot of gun legislation and regulation. Gun legislation around regulation, until they kind of changed their focus and became severely corrupted. If you were to just look at the advisement of the NRA and implemented those things from years back, you'd have much stronger gun laws right now. And again, that was advocated for by the NRA back in the day.
The thing that really fucks me up is that, like, when it comes to anti-capitalist rhetoric, you would think rural areas would be, like, the primo ground, Like, even if you want to stick to liberal Democrat, like, regulation tier talking points, rural America, like the Midwest, has been fucking destroyed by, like, big box marts, Like, all, like, local business has been catastrophically and irreversibly destroyed. Entirely as a product of like capitalist logic, synthesizing new material conditions. It's very, very direct. Even very basic regulatory stuff, like some basic workers' rights stuff, or like sourcing, or like local zoning mandating given commercial areas have access to X or Y, or like anti food desert legislation. Anything like this would be a way of making it better. Nothing Republicans do or advocate for is doing shit for dying Midwestern communities. They're just like, every moment they die more, and no trend is helping them. Like, nothing. It's a completely negative downward trajectory for millions of Americans, and it's such an easy sell to go to them and to try and be like, why is this happening? It's like 101 stuff, but there's no effort to do it. None whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting because here's the thing. You're right. It should be fertile ground for the Democratic Party, right? Because they can go in and say, hey, these have been your representatives for 40 years. And look where you've gone in 40 years. This is the reason why. But here's the deal. This is the reason why they won't do it, is because they're bought too. They may not be bought to the same extent, but there's certain things that they can't say. So the reason why they abandoned labor the way that they did. And the beauty of this idea of running as a lefty progressive in the Republican primary is that you can shit on the Democrats in a way that the Justice Democrats could never shit on mainstream leadership, right? And you can also shit on your Republican opponents and the Republican leadership by talking about corruption. Because
Yeah,
you would be the only person that would actually be talking about the issues that matter to these people's lives, right? And he goes, nobody else is going to do it because they can't do it. If they do, they're going to be seen to be as frauds.
I'm looking at it right now, and like from 2010 to 2020, rural America experienced its first decline in population in American history. Not as a percentage of the total population, but in terms of net numbers. In every other decade period in all of American history, the total number of people living in rural areas has gone up. But over from 2000 to 2010, so many people are leaving it. Like, people make a big deal about people moving out of California or New York, and yeah, housing prices, don't get me wrong, it's happening. But like, this is a massive change. And it's just because these places are like totally dead. We're soon going to be a country, like a ring of viable coastal cities where the average rent price is $8,000 a month, and then an interior core of just completely unusable, just underserved dog shit with a population of 8 people, each of who have like 10,000 times the electoral college representation power of the average voter. We'll have 8 people in the Midwest, and all of them get to choose their own senator, and the rest of us will be fighting over the coastal cities.
Well, the part of what you was talking about appealing to these folks. I think that if you're when you were talking about appealing to farmers, right? The farmers have the respect, right? Even if everybody's not working in farm work, okay? But they've missed a huge opportunity in talking about climate change to these farmers. Now they're starting to do it now, but this should have been something that they were doing 20, 30 years ago. It goes back to that thing I said about a lot of these folks have a Christian faith, right? And one of those main tenets was stewardship of the earth. People take that seriously, and yet it's something that is absent when it comes to political dialogue. I think that's crazy. The other thing that's going on right now in the rural areas is this is Mike Davis has talked about this, about people can't afford the suburbs, right? So they move into a lot of these rural areas, and I guess they're calling the exurbs now, right? And there's a tension between the folks that are in those rural areas that have lived there their whole lives, and these new people that are kind of starting to, to move in and what they feel like is take it over. And there's a weird tension going on right there. And again, a lot of that has to do with capitalism, right? But the Democrats are going to talk shit about capitalism, and the Republicans aren't. But yet, here's the thing: it's just like you said. There's all these people that are waiting and wanting a populist rhetoric, right? It's the reason why a lot of independents and a good deal of Republicans, they don't want to admit it, but a good deal of Republicans were also open to hearing Bernie Sanders' message, right? Because they're as disgusted with at least the results of capitalism, even if they don't think about it in those terms.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about the viability of authentic populist messaging.
Right.
Because if you're committed entirely to like institutionalist solutions, well, there is a kind of legitimate populism in the Republican Party, but it's towards fascism, which doesn't really address these issues. So they'll signal at those talking points, and they'll distract from the institutional reform they want, which in their case is going to be lower taxes for the wealthy and less regulation, which will enhance these problems. It'll make them worse. But no real redress. And then from the Democrats' perspective, you can get like milquetoast reform, but there will never be the energy. We're talking about, I mean, like, especially for people living in like relatively rural areas, I just don't think there's much respect, deservedly so. There's just not much respect for this like smug institutionalist, meandering that Democrats are so proud of. This, they go low, we go high. The only way to get anything done is through like quiet slow passage of legislative, bills or whatever. They want fiery messaging, and who wouldn't, given their circumstances, right? Like we're talking about dying communities where the nearest hospital is like a 30-mile drive away that has like 3 doctors on staff at any given point in time. Like, of course, they want radical solutions. The Republicans have taken to talking about how this country will, I don't know, literally fall into a pit to hell if Democrats take over. And the Democrats have responded to this by just ignoring like half the country entirely with their messaging. Whereas Republicans are willing to spend money on roundabout ways of appealing to people in major urban and industrial areas. Democrats do nothing to try to see the opposite. And we get this like infinite pocket of red representation in states that have disproportionate electoral and Senate voting power, by the way, which is not great for us.
Right. And it goes back to the idea, kind of what you're saying is that it's so tepid, right? So like it doesn't even matter if the Republican candidates are full of shit if they look like that they're fighting, right? Because a lot of the times they see the Democratic candidate and they don't think that they're actually fighting for them. And I think that you have to it has to be a real fight, and you have to stay on message over and over and over again. And I just don't see that happening. And this goes back to, Bernie was criticized for trying to keep his eye on working people. Like that's where we're at. And then they wonder why they lose so many districts. What was it, like 1,000 different seats, state and local over that period of time not too long ago. And they wonder why they lost all that when the candidate in the primaries that was actually trying to talk to the basic working person's life got criticized, for sticking on that message too heavily, I guess.
At least Republicans have the decency to lie about it. I mean, at least that represents some kind of effort on their part to appeal to these groups. We wouldn't have to lie. You don't have. It's preferable if you don't lie, but you have to do something. I mean, Bernie Sanders didn't lie. He was pretty straightforward with his messaging, and people liked him. Republicans had a hard time attacking Bernie Sanders. Because they still did, of course, but it's very difficult when he's so obviously like an outsider. He's an independent. He only ran as Democrat for electoral viability. He's not really buddies with the Democrat Party, which helps tremendously when it comes to distancing him from them with Republican messaging. He doesn't talk down to anyone. He's consistent. He's obviously honest. I don't think it's very tough to frame him as a dishonest guy. You can try. You can try anything. They framed Donald Trump as like Christ-like, but it's very tough. He doesn't make it easy. And Democrats hated him for it because any deviation from the model, the institutionalist Democrat model is a threat. It's a showcase of their their ineptitude, which they don't want.
That's right. And I said this in the book, or HF said this in the book, that the only reason why the Squad ran in the Democratic Party is because we don't have a parliament system. You know what I'm saying? So like because basically he's being interviewed and he's like, well, why are you running in the Republican Party? And he's like, because I live in a red district. Right. And he's basically saying, look, the Squad would love to run in another party. That's not the system that we have. In the system that we have, you have to play the game. And that's what those folks are doing. The problem with the Squad is that the game that they're having to play, they're not able to criticize the Democratic leadership in the way that I'm sure that they would like to. Right. Whereas in this situation where you're open about being a lefty progressive, you can be as irreverent and critical of the leadership of both parties as you want to, right? You can be as honest as you want to about it because everybody knows where you're already coming from. And that is, I would think, would be a huge breath of fresh air, because some people would see it as a novelty. That's fine. The novelty is what gets you the spectacle and the attention to be able to ask those big questions, right?
Oh, and it draws people's attention too. If you're like,
Right.
well, why are you even running as a Republican? Oh, well, I'd like to think my real interests are to support working people. I'm running as a Republican because that's the only thing you can do in this county. Like just
Right.
the obvious appeal to practicality, I think, is in a lot of people's minds respectable, because it suggests a kind of authentic political drive, that distances you from like ordinary like politics, like from ordinary like in-group politics. um I don't know. I think people tend to respond well to that if it's done well, if you don't come across as being duplicitous or overly ambitious. um
Yeah.
oh shit, okay. Time has passed remarkably quickly, probably because we agree on so much. We're 10 over the hour. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. I don't mean to rush you off. Was there another point you wanted to hit on, or like obviously you should say the name of your book again,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
the short attention span of our audience.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. And but I did want to ask you though, just really quickly, was there anything? And let me say this too, man. We'd had a few emails back and forth, and it was sparse. And I kept thinking, man, am I getting ready to come on this show and get taken to the woodshed? So I'm glad that we did agree on a lot of good, on a lot of stuff. But I'm curious if there was anything that you thought, no, I'm not buying that. I think it's a terrible idea. I was just curious about that.
No, well, I mean, my main concern would be like so I'm very anti-Republican Party, because right now they basically just seem to be like four bad things. There's a potential future where they're not. I mean, we had a whole party switch 50 years ago, right? Like in 50 more years, somehow it could end up being like any party could believe anything. It's not really like an inherent thing. My main concern would be the idea of trying to like outflank the left through economic populism and making concessions on progressive issues in the Republican Party, because a lot of people advocate for that. I think that's horseshit. There is no people's struggle without like linking arms with progressive issues. So, but you haven't talked about that. So if like outside of that, that's my main concern. And that can be addressed too. Also,
Yep, absolutely.
you're not gonna change the course of the Republican Party by attempting to like introduce diverse ranges of ideas in like local races in some very, very red areas. That lefties aren't that powerful. We're not going to derail the
Right.
entire GOP. But and if you're honest about it, if you're straightforward, that would entail a like it wouldn't involve that duplicity. Even if people in that vein got very powerful politically, it would never turn into some kind of stronger reactionary force, because we could only ever go up from there. There's no
Yeah.
downside
Exactly.
to the
Exactly.
GOP having more lefty progressive power in it at all.
Right.
There's no harm to that.
That's right.
Outside of some insane, like the lefties in the GOP fight to get the fascists in the GOP power, but I think that
Right.
that's like fantasy politics. I don't think that's I don't think that's a real thing worth thinking
Right.
about.
And I think that there's a hidden gem in there as well that I didn't think about when I was writing the book. And that is that if this was to, if you could get multiple candidates, I would love to see multiple candidates, because then it looks like a movement, looks like a block. But if you were to do this in multiple areas, after you're done, it's not just that you could go back and organize those places. It's that you could run referendums on a lot of these issues, and there'd be a lot of these Republicans that would be willing to give those a serious thought where they might not have before as well. I think that would be an important strategy to go along with that. So yeah, and I want to say this too, just really quickly about the book. Michael Albert was interviewing me, and he was saying that, look, I don't know about this, the strategy. I think it's interesting, but he thought that the book was valuable in the sense of giving lefties and organizers and activists a good read on how to talk to folks, right, and to be able to reach out in an authentic manner that could actually meet folks where they're at. So he thought that was, and the more I think about it and more I look back on the book, I think that is something that's useful in the book as well. But so again, the name of the book is "Don't Think of a Republican: How I Won a Republican Primary as a Lefty Progressive, and You Can Too" by H.F. Valentine. And I'm not trying to. I didn't write this book to make money. If you want to read it for free, if you go to unsafemedia.com/Republican, at the bottom of it, there's a free PDF there if you just want to read the thing for free. So that's unsafemedia.com/Republican. And I could give it two shits if if you buy the book. If you do, that's great. But I would love for people to read it and to get whatever they can out of the book. And I really, really appreciate you giving me the time to actually talk with you about this, because I've been watching you have these types of debates with folks about really serious, hard to talk about issues. And I think that you do a really solid job on it. And so I thought that this would be up your alley. So thanks for making the time.
The pleasure has very much been mine. Thank you very much for coming on. I'm sorry it took so long with the email back and forth. That's just me being organizationally deficient. It's nothing personal. I've enjoyed our talk very much.
All right, excellent. I hope we can do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. You know my email. You have a wonderful day, okay?
Thanks, Vaush. We'll see you.
See you. Bye. Well, that was nice. My lesson from that conversation is that leftism is good. I think leftism, it's good when leftism. In my opinion, you know. Yes, I'm sure you all paid attention the entire way through. You're all very good pog champs or whatever. Time to steal his content by reading his book to us on stream. Something tells me he would like that.